Good afternoon and welcome to the Quincy Institute's event, the $1 Trillion Pentagon Budget. Boondoggle or beneficial? I'm Ben Freeman, the director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute. We're here today because we're in something of a historic moment. For the very first time, the U.S. military budget has exceeded $1 trillion. This happened when the reconciliation bill became law last month. That bill added $156 billion in additional military spending, pushing the total military budget for fiscal year 2025 to $1.06 trillion. Over half of this new funding went to just 4 items in the reconciliation bill: shipbuilding, the so-called Golden Dome missile defense system, other munitions, and nuclear weapons. These programs, as with far too many Pentagon spending priorities of late, have been plagued by delays, cost overruns, and underperformance. Which leaves us with the question at the heart of this panel today. Will this new historic level of Pentagon spending be beneficial or just lead to more and more boondoggles? It's a big question. So thankfully for me, we have an all-star panel here to help us answer it. Our first speaker will be Julia Gledhill. Julia is a research analyst for the National Security Reform Program at the Stimson Center. She focuses her research and writing on Pentagon spending, military contracting, and weapon acquisition. In previous roles at the Project on Government Oversight and the Friends Committee on National Legislation, Julia worked on various national security issues related to Pentagon accountability, war powers, civilian protection, drones, torture, and the U.S. Lethal Strikes program. And for those of you thinking, Julia looks pretty familiar to me, that might be because you've seen her starring in the excellent new Al Jazeera series, The Business of War, which has just hit in the last couple weeks. Julia will be joined on the panel by Veronique de Rugy. Vero, as she's known, is the George Gibbs Chair in Political Economy and Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's also a nationally syndicated columnist. Her primary research interests include the U.S. economy, the federal budget, taxation, tax competition, and one of our favorites here at Quincy, cronyism. Her popular weekly columns address economic issues ranging from lessons on creating sustainable economic growth to the implications of government tax and fiscal policies. She's testified numerous times in front of Congress on the effects of fiscal stimulus, debt and deficits, and regulation of the economy. Previously, de Rugy was a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a policy analyst at the Cato Institute, and a research fellow at the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. Now, last but certainly not least is my colleague, Bill Hartung. Bill investigates the arms industry and U.S. military budget here at the Quincy Institute and was previously the director of the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy and the co-director of CIP's Sustainable Defense Task Force. He has authored multiple books on this topic, including Profits of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. I am fortunate enough to call Bill the co-author of our forthcoming book, The $1 Trillion War Machine: How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts Us at Home. That book will come out November 11th on Veterans Day. Like Vero, Bill is also a national columnist and has testified before Congress numerous times. Needless to say, we've got an all-star panel here, so I'm certainly eager to hear what our panelists have to say about this historic moment. With that, enough from me. Julia has graciously offered to give opening remarks first. So Julia, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ben, for introducing me. I appreciate you all for joining us today for what will no doubt be a stimulating conversation about the national security budget, and appreciate the Quincy Institute for having me on this panel. I want to start off by explaining what reconciliation even is, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then I'll get into how it is that we actually ended up with a $1 trillion plus national security budget this year. So first off, all you really need to know about reconciliation is that it is a special procedure that enables Congress to advance measures without a supermajority of 60 votes in the Senate. That makes it a very attractive option for a majority party to push bills through the Senate, especially ones pertaining to the federal budget. So reconciliation only requires a simple majority of 51 votes by avoiding the filibuster, which of course enables any senator to block a measure by delaying or preventing a vote on the Senate floor altogether. While the House can generally pass bills with a simple majority, reconciliation really greases the wheels in the Senate to move bills along to the president's desk where they can be made law. So now that we have that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about what reconciliation bills cover. They are essentially budget bills. They must deal with spending, taxes, or the federal debt ceiling, or of course, all of the above. And this year, the Republican Party finagled the reconciliation process to achieve this $1 trillion plus top line for national security, even given a razor thin majority of 53 seats in the Senate. Now, there were 3 Republicans who did break with their party and voted against the bill in the Senate. Those members were Tom Tillis, Susan Collins, and Senator Rand Paul, which meant that J.D. Vance was the tiebreaker on the reconciliation package, passing the bill by a vote of 51-50. So this was very, very close. Even still, the reconciliation package provided a little over $156 billion in national security funding. The administration is expected to spend $117 billion in fiscal year 2026. So when you combine that figure with the president's budget request, national security spending far exceeds $1 trillion in this fiscal year, this coming fiscal year of 2026. Obviously, this is a lot of money, but there are 2 other general points I'd like to make about this reconciliation process. The first one is that reconciliation has become an incredibly partisan maneuver, and this reconciliation bill really sets a disturbing precedent for national security budgeting in general. The administration relied on the reconciliation process to reach this coveted $1 trillion threshold, of which they seem to be very proud, including big ticket items like the Golden Dome missile defense system at a cost of about $25 billion. Now, that is a shocking sticker price included in a highly partisan bill that received 0 votes from Democrats. And obviously, this is a matter of policy that should be debated and deliberated over across the aisle, as has been the case in the annual defense policy bill for decades. Of course, that process has also deteriorated, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about how Congress is broken throughout this conversation. The second point I want to make about the reconciliation bill is that it was quite vague about how exactly the money will be spent. When you read through the bill, you see many provisions noting that appropriation funds remain available through fiscal year 2029. But unlike a typical appropriations bill, the reconciliation package was not paired with the usual justification documents and spending plans detailing how the Pentagon will spend money in a certain time period. Now, the reason for that is because reconciliation provides mandatory funding as opposed to discretionary funding. And when we talk about the Pentagon budget, we're typically talking about the discretionary spending that Congress decides on every single year through the annual defense policy bill, which is the National Defense Authorization Act. So typically, Congress first has to pass the NDAA, and then lawmakers have to pass the Department of Defense appropriations bill to provide the funds to spend that money. Now, mandatory spending is different because lawmakers essentially approve and appropriate funding in one step as opposed to the 2-step process required for discretionary funding. As you can imagine, the 2-step process can get quite messy with appropriators often drafting the spending bill before the NDAA is even done. And in theory, lawmakers would pass that policy bill before they move on to making nitty-gritty spending decisions. And so you'll have to forgive me for harping on this detail, but it really is significant for national security spending to provide, such huge sticker price items like Golden Dome missile defense funding through reconciliation, which again is a much easier process to approve and then appropriate funding on national security, when in fact lawmakers really should be deliberating over these big policy decisions. So I will pause there and hand it back over to Ben for the rest of my panelists to provide their intro remarks.
Thank you so much, Julia. Vera, very much looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks. Thank you for having me, and thanks for the introduction. So first I want to start with something that just people don't really quite think about when talking about military spending and defense spending in general, and that's America's greatest long-term national security threat is not China, not Russia, not Iran, but it's actually our own unsustainable fiscal path outside of the Department of Defense. Leaders from both parties, from former Secretary of State, Defense, Treasury, and Homeland Security, have warned that the rising threat, the rising threat we face is our rising debt, and that's actually really outsized. Is a really outsized danger, and I think they're right. So today the federal debt is larger than our entire economy. It will double in the next, depending on what happens, it will double in the next 30 to 50 years. And because spending and borrowing for the so-called entitlement programs are growing. And as debt rises, interest costs crowd out other priorities, and that include defense spending. Economic growth slows, private investment is displaced, and foreign creditors grow uneasy. A nation that cannot keep its fiscal house in order will eventually lose the economic base that support diplomacy, defense, and security. Not to mention that a major debt crisis isn't good for investment in security. What it means is that those who want to see defense budget grow actually want to see the country well protected about foreign threats, right? If they were serious about it, they would be the first biggest advocate for entitlement reform. Unfortunately, with very few exceptions, conservatives in particular, who are, all out on spending more money on defense, regardless of its value, have become completely quiet on reforming the drivers of our future debt. Now, the second point I'd like to make is, while the biggest threat to national security isn't China, but is our budget, sadly, it is also unclear that the DoD itself could effectively defend us against a China threat. So while the defense budget is huge and growing, within the Pentagon, resources are squeezed to the point that between 2/3 and 3/4 of the defense budget is already fenced off, locked in, before the Department of Defense or Congress can make any real choices to advance strategy or response to emerging threats. Personal cost, pay, pension, healthcare benefits rise automatically every year in pretty much the same way that entitlement spending are growing in the rest of the budget. They consume over 40% of the budget. Retirement and healthcare costs alone consume over 30% of the budget. According to McKinsey Eagle at AEI, and I quote, "The Pentagon spends more on defense healthcare program than on new ships. It spends $10 billion more on Medicare than on new tactical vehicle, and more on environmental restoration and running schools than on microelectronic and space launches combined." End quote. So we now have a level of bureaucracy that functions like a silent tax on modernization. And these are expenses that keep Americans safe. Obviously, we need some personnel to keep Americans safe, but the scale of the problem we have is so big that actually it's not that hard to actually say this is not what keeps Americans safe. And there are the inertia that keeps the Pentagon stuck. So unless we reform the Pentagon, will mortgage its future to pay for its past, and entitlement will eat the seed corn of security. My final point is this one. Of course, each time anyone talks about downsizing this mountain of bureaucracy, we are met with warning about decline in GDP and recession and such. Those of us who were there during the super committee and remember that debate very well. So I'll finish with this. This argument is completely wrong. Yes, it is true that the Pentagon employs a large number of people, and these employees spend money and consume. But those resources, the labor and tax dollars, come from somewhere. The job we see in the Pentagon, the dollar we spend on healthcare, come at the expenses of businesses that were never started, goods never produced, and opportunities lost. 10 years ago, Professor Robert Barrow at Harvard and I set out to actually look at the literature, the economic literature on this issue. And we find that a dollar increase in defense spending, especially when deficit financed, which is where we are now, raises GDP by less than $1, while $1 in defense cuts actually boost private activities by about $1.30 over 5 years. So government doesn't create wealth, it merely reallocates it. And along the way, we have to recognize that $1 spent on defense actually has a return that is less than the dollar it takes away from the economy. So that means what? That means that the proper way, the only test of defense spending is whether it makes America safer. If it does, fund it. If it doesn't, cut it. And I'll end here.
Such powerful lines. Thank you, Vera. That was like a bumper sticker after bumper sticker there. Thank you so much for those insights. Last but certainly not least, my good friend and colleague, Bill Hartung. The floor is yours, sir.
I was muted. I'm drowning in common sense, which is a good thing in a Washington panel. And I'm honored to be with Julia, Veronique, and the inestimable Ben Freeman. Julia and I go back as writing partners for a while, and she goes where no sane person wants to go in terms of analysis, like, oh, the Pentagon's changing its program and policy and budgeting efforts. I got to look into that. Or, oh, there's a study on the defense industrial base strategy. Like, not only does she do it, she does it with relish. She comes back with what it's about, who benefits, who doesn't. And then people like me write about it. And back in the day, the study that Veronique mentioned, at the time of sequestration, where they were going to cap the Pentagon budget, the industry was crying wolf about how it was going to wreck the economy. And they paid some guy to run a back of the envelope thing, claiming as such. So debunking that was very important. In fact, even some conservative members of Congress are like, I don't trust these industry flacks anymore. Stop visiting me. So we need that kind of analysis now, because the jobs argument is front and center by our deal maker in chief. So anyway, there's a few things. First of all, as was said, a lot of the money is locked up in personnel and benefits and et cetera. But the question is, what do we need that size military? And we only need it if we're going to have this cover the globe strategy with 750 military bases, hundreds of thousands of troops overseas, special forces operations in 78 countries, pouring weapons into all manner of conflict zones. Sure, if you're going to do that, you need a large military. But if you had an actual defense strategy that was restrained, where allies took care of some of their own responsibilities, where you only went to war when there was an absolute national security risk and there was no other option, you could have a smaller, leaner, more effective military. So that's point one. Point two is the way we buy weapons is completely dysfunctional, because it's about parochial interest, not about what works or what serves the interests of military personnel. So there's endless examples of things like the littoral combat ship, the F-35, aircraft carriers, things that either don't function at all or are not very useful for future conflicts, that are being preserved because there's jobs in Virginia or Missouri or California or Georgia. And you can't have a rational defense strategy if you decide what to buy based on whose district it is. If you have a strategy, you pick the weapons that serve that strategy. And we're not doing that. Back in the 80s, during the Reagan buildup, there was a military reform caucus, 100 members in the House, bipartisan. And they had a simple message. The stuff we're buying is too complicated, doesn't work well. We're not holding the contractors accountable. And people are the center of defense. You need well-trained, well-motivated people backed up by a well-educated, healthy, unified country. And if you don't have that, all the technology in the world is not going to save you. So that's not a peace message. That's just a sensible approach to defense. And I think we need more of that kind of thinking now, particularly when you think about things like Golden Dome. And maybe I'll end on this, but there's all this concern about the defense industrial base. Can we supply allies? Do we make enough artillery shells? Do we have a skilled workforce to build the equipment we need? If that were the case, and I think it's arguable, why on earth would you spend untold amounts of money on Golden Dome, which is like a warmed over version of Reagan's Star Wars program? When Reagan gave that speech, he promised an impenetrable missile shield that no ICBM could penetrate. And at that moment, 7,200 scientists signed a petition saying that's physically impossible. I'm not going to take money for this fraudulent program. And every test since has proven them right. The long range interceptors have failed about half the time, and the tests are scripted. Like in real life, they wouldn't call you up and say, "Oh, I'm about to launch a missile now." But that's how the test works. They know when it's coming. They don't use decoys. And in space, if you deploy balloons in the weightlessness of space, they look suspiciously like a nuclear reentry vehicle. They've never done those sorts of realistic tests. So almost every scientist who's not on the payroll of the Pentagon or industry will tell you there's no such thing as a flawless defense against ICBMs. Donald Trump has gone one higher. We'll also defend against hypersonic missiles, low-flying drones, cruise missiles. It's at best a marketing technique, and at worst, a fraudulent program that's going to actually make the world more dangerous. Because whether it works or not, other countries are going to use worst-case planning and say, well, what if it did work? Maybe we need more offensive nuclear weapons, and we'll be off in this offense-defense arms race, which is exactly why Richard Nixon signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which unfortunately was abandoned under George W. Bush. So the only thing that's good about Golden Dome is if you're Anduril, if you're Lockheed Martin, if you're RTX, there's enough money for everybody. It's one big happy family. But if they really are serious that we've got serious defense needs that are being neglected, it's an outrage to be spending money on this, fool's errand. So I'll leave it at that because I'm sure there's much more to discuss.
On that cheery note, thank you all so much. In addition to being a remarkable panelist, you were also remarkably on time, and so we have ample time for Q&A here. For those of you who are tuned in, our participants that are in the Zoom call, sorry for those of you watching on X, YouTube, or elsewhere, you can't play this part of the game. But for those in the meeting here, if you want to ask a question, we very much encourage audience participation. Click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there and type your question in. Ideally, make sure your question doesn't factor in with a question mark. That'll dramatically increase the odds of us being able to answer it. No monologues, please. I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here for a second because all of you, I wrote down so many notes. You said so many fascinating things, but I'll keep myself to one per person. And Julia, I'd love to start with you. You did such an extraordinary job explaining that crazy convoluted reconciliation process, how extraordinary that was, and how broken Congress is. What I'd like you to do is do the hardest thing. Get out your crystal ball and say, what do you see going forward? Do you, for 2026, do you see, a CR coming? Do you see these trillion-dollar budgets continuing into the future? Or do you see, kind of this being a one-shot infusion and then coming down to some kind of normalcy in later years?
These are the hardest questions to answer because no one wants to be wrong in predicting the future. But what I will say is that, the reconciliation process was egregious and had a lot of just shock value because of this trillion-dollar top line in 2026 alone. But, something else that struck me about the process is, as I mentioned in my intro comments, reconciliation bills have to provide mandatory spending. Now, when you think about mandatory spending, you usually think about Social Security or Medicare, or as Veronique mentioned, entitlements. So maybe it's retirement for Pentagon employees and things like that. And so it really got me thinking, okay, when you're talking about the Pentagon budget, as I said, we do typically deal with the discretionary budget, which has been sort of teetering on the edge of that $1 trillion threshold for a few years now, and we've sort of known that it was coming. But if you actually think about mandatory spending, if you think about interest on the debt, if you think about Veterans Affairs, if you think about the Department of Homeland Security, if you think about, of course, and we often include nuclear spending at the Department of Energy or the National Nuclear Security Administration, we've been above the $1 trillion threshold for several years now. And so when we think about how reconciliation put us across this finish line, yes, it is significant that in fiscal year 2026, you have, achieved that through the discretionary national security budget, in addition to reconciliation funds. But in reality, when you look at mandatory spending as a whole, we've been there. We've been closer to 2 trillion. And so, as someone who's written about this for a few years, that's something I can definitely put a finer point on, because I've absolutely focused my attention on the Pentagon base budget and, sometimes broadened that out to other discretionary spending on nuclear or other defense related activities, as is the budget subfunction for those who know, But, we honestly should really look at national security spending as it is, which is what portion of the national security budget is contributing to interest on the debt. In 2024, interest payments on the federal debt exceeded that of the defense budget. And you had some members of Congress saying, well, that's a reason to increase national security spending. But hey, like we've been closer to the $2 trillion mark when you consider things like Veterans Affairs, when you consider retirement benefits and other mandatory national security spending. So I guess to answer your question without really answering it, we've been there and I think we will stay there.
Vera, that actually takes me into a question I was going to directly ask you. The VA budget. You mentioned the health and benefits, everything, those soaring costs within the DoD budget. We've also seen this extraordinary spending at the VA too. And this is something I think that folks don't typically count. To Julia's point, we don't think of those costs, but these are, whether we want to recognize it or not, these are a cost of the wars, those forever wars that we had in the 21st century. So I very much love to hear your thoughts on the VA budget or anything. Really, I feel like Julia teed you up so well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, first, I will say, I agree with Julia that looking at the whole defense ecosystem actually puts you way over the trillion and for a long time. And that's the way to really actually look at this. And then we talk about defense, the DoD spending, and that doesn't include the VA spending. But I will answer your question that you asked, Julia. I think actually it's inevitable that we're going to stay above $1 trillion just for DoD. And the reason is that because so much of the budget is locked into these personnel costs and defense costs, the only way Congress is going to feel they can actually modernize anything or invest, however you want to think about it, in defense spending, is going to be to add on top. If they don't have the courage to actually engage in real reform of that big massive spending, it's inevitable. You just take the big block for granted. You add to it rather than actually ever say, let's actually look at whether any of that money is increasing national security, like I wish they did. On the VA spending, I mean, the VA spending is way larger for healthcare. Then it's nearly double basically the DoD health system spending. So like the DoD spend, it's TRICARE. It includes TRICARE, and it covers active duty service member, their family, retiree, and some survivor. And the VA budget is veterans healthcare, disability compensation, pension, education, housing benefit, and such. And that is an enormous chunk of money. And I believe that if you take the DoD healthcare spending and the VA, you're well over $170 trillion. Just the healthcare military spending. So that's an enormous chunk of money.
Thank you so much, Bureau. Bill Hartung, did you want to chime in on this one, or am I free to
Oh,
fire?
no. Yeah, briefly. We haven't even mentioned that the Pentagon hires many private contract personnel. They don't even know how many they have, but it's well over 500,000. And many of them, as Ben's old Hunting Grounds Project Government Oversight has pointed out, do redundant things. One time, Robert Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, was asked how many of these folks there were. He said he didn't know. So you've got huge numbers of civilian government personnel. You've got all these contractors. And in fact, more than half the Pentagon budget goes to contractors of one sort or another. Not always for weapons, could be healthcare, could be, sending them pencils. But a huge amount of it goes into the corporate sector. So as for predicting, I think, normally the Pentagon does the opposite of what I suggest. So I'm thinking maybe I'm going to propose a $3 trillion Pentagon budget, and they'll be like, well, if that's what they want, we're going to cut it, But it's kind of a Hail Mary. I'm not really sure if it's going to work.
Bill, my question for you is, you and I have this book coming out, and I think the number one question we always get is, okay, this is pretty terrible what you've described. What do we do about it? How do we turn the tide? And I think I don't disagree with Julia Arviro here about the trajectory we're on. But if we were going to get off this crazy spending trajectory, how would you see that happening, Bill?
Well, first, the proofreader me says we have to change the title to the $1.06 trillion war machine, because I think it's a lot catchier. But I've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of times I'll give a talk and they'll be like, Bill, what are you going to do about this? Like it's up to me personally, which is unfortunate. It's a societal effort because, as we show in the book, the influence of the war machine is societal. It's not just lobbyists and campaign contributions. It's Hollywood, it's gaming, it's our universities, it's flyovers at sporting events. It's kind of embedded in the economy, the political structure, the culture. So incremental reforms are not going to get it done, although we should certainly do those, like, stop contractors from price gouging. And what I've seen, to the extent that are significant movements on different issues, most of them deal with militarization in one form or another. It's budget priorities, nuclear weapons, militarization of the border, militarization of the police, the role of military contracting at our universities. So I think there's got to be a bit of a common thread that says, this is not the way a democratic society should function. And, going back to Eisenhower, he talked about the collaboration between the uniformed military and the contractors. He gave the Congress a pass, although obviously they're part of the problem. But he also said to beware of the scientific technological elite, that there's not going to be some magic technological development that's going to save us. And if you look at the militarist leaders in Silicon Valley, that's kind of what they're selling. Our technology will set you free. And at a minimum, we better, check that. Because there's been many technologies touted in the same way that have not worked, from the electronic battlefield in Vietnam to Reagan's, Star Wars flawless shield, even the revolution of military affairs, which is about network warfare, precision guided munitions. Even when that stuff works, it was not even able to prevail in the kind of wars we sent our personnel into, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they were being killed with improvised explosive devices, while we had the most advanced technology and amazing amounts of resources. So I think people have to understand that when it comes to spending on the Pentagon, more can be less. I mean, of course, the Pentagon knows how to spend $1 trillion, but is it going to help us? Is it going to protect us? And given all the other things we face, be it climate, be it public health, be it just fiscal stability, I think people need to come around to the fact that if we want to put this country back in the right direction, you can't really ignore the Pentagon budget. I think a lot of people are, well, let the experts figure it out above my pay grade. We need more Julias who go down into the deep, come back with the wonky details, and then make it publicly accessible. So I think it's, nothing's guaranteed, but I think there may be some newfound attention to this, even in arts and cultures, as well as in the traditional discussion. So, I'm not going to make any predictions because I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm usually proven wrong. But I think this is my moment where there is going to be, people are going to come together around this issue and in a way that they haven't in a long time, simply because in many ways the future of the country is at stake.
Can I add on to that really quickly, Ben?
Please, please.
Okay, so Bill talked about how militarism is embedded in our society and how it really colors the way that we view military strength and its importance to the US role on the global stage. I just want to pose a question. Imagine if we funded our military with taxes. To Vero's point before, I think the last time we did that was the Korean War, but instead we have deficit financed militarism, deficit financed endless wars, which continue to this day, right? Because we're still conducting counterterrorism activities in dozens of countries around the world. And when we talk about the Pentagon budget, we're often highlighting the ways in which taxpayers are impacted. Military contractors are price gouging on the taxpayer's dime. Now, that is kind of an indirect relationship because we are financing our military through deficit spending, right? But to Vero's point, in an era of stagnation, when you do have advocates of, military spending to stimulate the economy, pushing for greater and greater Pentagon budget top lines or national security budget top lines, depending on how broad you want to look at the security infrastructure across the federal government, the American people, taxpayers, the public are feeling the impacts of this ever expanding Pentagon spending and deep-seated militarism, not necessarily because their tax dollars are directly funding the military, but because of those opportunity costs that Vero outlined so well for us. And so, if we're talking big ideas, imagine that taxes actually just paid for war instead of dipping deeper and deeper into our coffers, and doing deficit financed militarism. I think it would drastically change the way that we talk about national security and what it means to actually be strong.
I'll add something if it's okay with you, Ben.
Oh, please.
The thing that actually shocks me the most when people talk about defense spending and how big it is and how it's or how we need more of it is that there's not a lot of conversations about what that spending is funding. And that should be front and center of literally everything we talk about. And the fact that people don't realize that so little actually of the budget would be capable of really truly defending the nation, or like switching or like creating a strategy to address threats, new threats or emerging threats. I think there's just a lot of people who don't actually quite realize how much of the budget is locked in, and hence just not conducive to actually do a lot of defending for us. And I wish kind of that were part of a broader conversation that we have systematically when we talk about the size of the defense budget, because then you could, in theory, get some conservatives who are in favor of more defense spending in the name that they think that additional defense spending brings more national security to the country. They would realize that, I think this is what they want, but this is not what they get because of where the money often is going, right? And so I'm always kind of amazed how these things are totally disconnected. The other thing that I will say is that the Department of Defense seems to be suffering from enormous amount of cronyism And basically, and there's just a mentality that because we've been spending on a certain weapon, because we've been giving money to a certain company for, like, that should continue. It doesn't seem to be, from the outside looking in, and not looking very deeply, a lot of actually rethinking about the way the money is spent, ever, or where it goes. It's kind of like there's so much that seems to be on autopilot. And so I just think that it's just kind of amazing to me how defense spending is actually a source of tension in the country, without any sides actually being willing to kind of dig into what is this money for, and where is it going. And I'll finish with one thing. There's also always, we all always put, at least until recently, we're like always said, the conservatives want more spending, and then you have the hawks who want more defense spending, and then you have the left wants less spending on defense. But the truth of the matter is, through loopholes like emergency spending, right? There's this really unhealthy marriage that takes place, maybe not year after year, but actually quite often, where they're actually trading more defense spending for more non-defense spending outside of the regular budget appropriation system. And basically, we make the system worse and less transparent, and we make the whole nation less safe, whether because spending is becoming, or our debt is becoming more untenable, our fiscal path is unsustainable, but also because we have all this money in the defense budget that is consumed for things that are not promoting real national security.
Thank you all so much. But believe it or not, you used your crystal balls and answered like half a dozen questions we had in the Q&A just in your back and forth there. So thank you all for making my job so easy. But we do have several questions in the Q&A. I'm noticing Fritz Heinzen and Michael Lonergan, amongst others, have questions about defense tech. And we know this has been just a huge surge this year. The primes have been, we mentioned some of those names, the Lockheed Martins of the world are really getting challenged, for the first time in decades, honestly. And so Fritz Heinzen has a question asking, what do you think about the Replicator initiative and just generally the role of defense innovation, strengths and weaknesses? And I'd like to broaden that out and just get y'all's thoughts on the defense tech sector, period. And where do you see this kind of clash of the titans going forward between the defense tech firms and the longstanding primes?
Well, I sent my resume to some of them folks, but they're not responding. I think on paper, it makes sense for there to be competition. It makes sense not to buy lumbering, old, overpriced legacy systems. It makes sense to benefit from new technological developments. But that's not all there is to it. A lot of the leaders in military tech make it sound like they have capabilities far beyond what exists now. And when Kathleen Hicks during the Biden years gave the announcement of the Replicator initiative, it was no mistake that she gave the speech at a convention of the National Defense Industrial Association, the biggest association of weapons contractors. And she said, well, China, we're gonna build more nimble, more accurate. We're basically going to, use our technology and these new approaches from Silicon Valley to leave China far behind militarily. And she even more or less, challenged the Chinese leadership without even having the technology to back it up. It was almost like, let's rattle their cage and see what happens. It was not, a lot of the things these folks are talking about are prospective, and their idea of how to procure is to get rid of regulations, including independent testing. A lot of this is complex software. A lot of people know about that are going to work in industry. They're not going to work in government. Government will be less equipped to evaluate it. And then I think the thing that bothers me the most is if Silicon Valley wants to provide a product, provide a product. Don't try to influence our foreign policy, our democracy. Don't embed yourself in our government. Don't start telling us what America should be about. The president of Palantir has a book about the technological republic, and it's kind of like 19th century ideology with 21st century technology. He basically says America's a bunch of slackers. All we do is watch reality TV, play video games. We need a unifying national mission. And in his opinion, it is a Manhattan Project to militarize artificial intelligence. And he says we can develop an impregnable lead over China. They'll never catch up, which is what they said at the beginning of the atomic age. We can dominate the world. We don't have to make deals on this stuff. And it's just not plausible. So I think if we're going to use tech, we have to use it intelligently in support of a reasonable strategy. And all these fantasies of Silicon Valley about living forever, mass colonization of space, letting gamers like Palmer Luckey opine on defense strategies if they know what they're talking about, all that has to be put to the side.
Julia, you're here to chime in on that one. I saw
Actually,
Julia.
yes, I was waiting for you to ask because I didn't want to add on to everything Bill says, but yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I will start on the merits of Replicator. I think conceptually it makes sense to have low cost attributable drones. I think is strategically sound, and to think about them almost like ammunition, I think is the correct way to move forward. However, two finer points. The first is that contractors are not incentivized to make low cost items. That's part of the reason why we have such an issue with ammunition, right? Because they want to make the exquisite, expensive stuff because that's what's profitable. Number two, the issue with something like the Replicator program or collaborative combat aircraft is that you need them to swarm like a flock of birds, right? That requires pretty sophisticated software. And what troubles me about the conversation around software development in military technology is that the testing would likely be done in virtual environments, which is very difficult to validate and make credible, to put to put it in the most generous terms. And you also encounter the issue of intellectual property. And imagine if we start moving toward a world in which low cost drones, these attributable drones, are considered something like ammunition, then it becomes really important for contractors to figure out how the heck to make money out of that, right? And they're going to make money through the software development piece. If they own the intellectual property, if they're also responsible for testing that software, then it's kind of the perfect recipe for bilking the government. And so I have a lot of, concerns or questions about how exactly it is that we are supposed to fund software development in an iterative way, right? Because the argument is we need this big bucket for software development. You can't necessarily fit it into the traditional life cycle phases of a physical industrial process where you're moving from development and testing to procurement of that weapon in large numbers. So without getting into the weeds of some of the proposals right now to change the way that we buy weapons, there are many reasons to be concerned about software development and contractors really cashing in on these cyber physical capabilities, like, for example, drone swarms, which again require this, sophisticated software development. And so for me, I think about government control or government capacity to actually develop that technology itself. I kind of err on the side of thinking that the military should probably have that IP. And I think that is going to prove incredibly difficult for the government to move forward. And, as is already the case with a lot of major weapon programs, the Pentagon will be reliant on military contractors because they have the IP for that software as they are testing it, as they're developing it further. And just the last thing I will say also is that Silicon Valley firms, a lot of them, these military tech companies, rely on government contracts, and they are on the same page with the prime contractors on how to reform the way we buy weapons. This is the major acquisition reform movement that's been revitalized in the defense policy bill process this year. Again, I won't bore y'all with the details, but I really just want to emphasize that the military tech firms and the primes, as much as they butt heads or Silicon Valley tries to distinguish itself from the likes of Lockheed Martin, they're on the same page when it comes to making it easier for the Pentagon to buy weapons and speeding up that process, because they will both drastically benefit from it financially.
I think another point worth mentioning here, Riley Robinson put in the chat. It wasn't a question, but I'm going to read it, Riley. How do we know where the money is going when defense can't pass an audit? So to all your points there, if you have, it's the largest government agency, it's the only government agency that is yet to pass a full financial audit. So yeah, to all your points, all those questions remain. But while we're on Silicon Valley, we've had a couple questions in the chat now about one man, might be a four-letter word these days in DC, Elon Musk, in Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. It came to the Pentagon, right? Cut all the fat? What are our thoughts on Doge and DOG? And I will out myself that I I had multiple pieces that had titles to the effect of how DOD keeps dodging the Doge. I just wanted to use as much alliteration as possible. Any thoughts on DOD and Doge?
Well, even when Musk used to keep his little inaccurate website and how much should they save from different departments, the Pentagon ranked number 16 in savings. And Pete Hegseth gave this speech. He was all proud about savings they had made. It was some minor changes in how they buy personal computers out of this $1 trillion budget. And he thought this was something to brag about. But they didn't touch major weapon systems. In fact, they had rules like don't go after anything nuclear. There was like 17 categories they couldn't even touch. They sent in people who had never worked on these issues to make these decisions in short order. Efficiency is supposed to be you study the problem, you get rid of what doesn't work, and you keep what does work. It's not demolish certain agencies and give certain other ones a free pass. And even though the bromance between Trump and Musk is gone, the Silicon Valley folks are embedded in the government. And of course, J.D. Vance was nurtured in Silicon Valley by the head of Palantir, the founder of Palantir. So I think they gave efficiency a bad name. I think we do need efficiency, but it's got to be by taking a careful look at what you're trying to change, what programs work, what doesn't. That certainly was not done. And so in that sense, Mr. Musk did us a great disservice, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And this is actually true about the way they went about doing everything with Doge, no matter where they looked. Instead of thinking strategically about what needs to be cut, they went and just basically went and like went after. It was basically kind of the woke version of the right, where whatever triggered them, they cut. And there was no thinking about, should the federal government be doing this? Maybe it should be privatized. Maybe it should be delegated to the state. It was none of this. It was just like long list. And I have nothing against actually cutting even small items if it's not going to balance the budget, because I think a lot of stuff the government shouldn't be doing in the first place. But if we're going to be changing things at the Pentagon or outside of the Pentagon, there needs to be actually broader thinking about what this particular program should actually be doing and what is this program doing. And that takes time. And it's not as if all of us have done this for decades. And there's a whole community out there that has put out so many papers actually making the case about how we should be thinking about this. But they went about it like in the kind of the most sloppy way. And I'm not even leaving aside the constitutional aspect to this. And it's really disappointing, because Bill is entirely right. In the process, because of their failure, which was inevitable because they had no strategy, they gave efficiency a bad name.
The one thing I'll add is that the gag about the Department of Government Efficiency is that it itself was a redundant institution. The Government Accountability Office exists. And I think the stat is that for every dollar spent on the GAO, it saves 30-something dollars. So hilariously, DOGE was itself replicating an effort that has already been undertaken by the GAO for
And by the
decades.
way, in reconciliation, they cut the GAO funding, which is stunning. It's like, I'm all for cutting lots of government spending, but this makes no sense, especially from a group that claims to care about, efficiency.
I want to, we just got time for maybe a quick rapid response to one of our earliest questions in the chat. And it was effectively about the risks of having a budget like this. And it really goes to Vero's point about this historic level of national debt that we're at now. And this is a question from Harris Contos, and it's effectively about using the Soviet Union as a corollary. And during the Cold War, Soviets infamously overspent in the military and at least partially helped to lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. What do you see as the risks here? And this is definitely a question geared at Vero, but I'd love Bill and Julia, your comments on military spending and its contribution to this historic level of national debt.
Well, I think my colleagues should go first. So,
Well, I'll repeat what I said. I just think that inevitably, when you have unsustainable spending that is translated into growing exponentially growing debt, right, and interest on the debt. Just to give you an idea, interest on the debt, assuming actually not a rapid increase in interest rates. In fact, the CBO projects that interest on the debt is going to kind of stabilize and go back down, not to the levels where it was before, but still nonetheless relatively lower than they are now. In 30 years, we'll be consuming not quite 45% of revenue, but 40 or so percent of revenue. There's a moment where things are gonna give, right? And it is inevitable, for instance, that as interest payment on the debt, and this is without talking about us having a debt crisis. In fact, I actually think the most likely case in a country like the US is like we actually pay the price of our enormous growing debt in the form of much lower growth, which has all sorts of problems in and of themselves. But the growth of interest payment on the debt means it's going to be crowding out all sorts of things that actually people want, and that should be actually done by the government. And as we know that Congress is terrible at actually making strategic decision about spending, including when it comes to defense, they will be preserving this enormous bureaucracy, and what's going to be cut out is going to be stuff like that actually could be potentially be national defense enhancing. I just don't trust them to not just basically protect special interest, and this is bad for everything. It's bad for the health of the nation, but it's bad arguably for national security.
I will be brief by just saying that I think it is incumbent upon the US government to improve the economic well-being of its people. Ever expanding Pentagon budgets do not do that because of the crowding out effect, because of the impact on the debt. And ultimately, the United States is going to have to start justifying its military spending, especially in this shifting geopolitical environment and in an environment where the United States is not the undeniable superpower of the world. There has to be some kind of recognition that this moment could be on its way out. And the United States, beyond balancing its budget, also needs to address rising inequality, Gilded Era level inequality in the United States, and serve its people. And that is not going to happen when you conflate economic stimulation with true national security, what is actually needed to maintain our military.
I'll be very, very brief. The tough guys in Washington are basically accelerating American decline because they're putting all the money in the military basket. They decimated aids to international development. They're purging the diplomatic corps. They're not investing in science or public health. Climate change is a dirty word being scrubbed from government websites. So if you look at the whole array of threats that we face, most of them are not being addressed at all. Even international institutions, which give the U.S. some influence, are being shunned. So basically, the only instrument we have left is the military, and we don't have a good strategy. We don't have a good procurement approach. So we're just it's the opposite of being tough. I mean, it's being stupid. We need a smart strategy. We need an effective strategy. To me, toughness also means discipline of mind, like tough-minded thinking, and we're certainly not getting that when it comes to Pentagon spending.
Stop being stupid. You heard it here, folks. All jokes aside, Vero, Julia, Bill, thank you so much for an enlightening panel. I learned a lot, and I feel like I'm a Pentagon budget nerd just like you. So thank you so much for your participation. For those that are tuning in to QI webinars, got another wonderful one tomorrow at 11 a.m. with my colleague Karthik, who's going to talk Venezuela sanctions, a new book. For now, please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists, and thank all of you for tuning in. What a wonderful session.